I'd like to tell you an aquarium story. Obviously, I have aquariums. This story starts in 1963 when the Beatles played Ed Sullivan. I was 10 years old. And the family got a 10-gallon aquarium in the living room, and it was just a tremendous amount of fun. We all got together as a family, brother Dan, mom and dad, myself, and it was just a great project. And a little while after we set it up, we had some gold wag platies, which are live bearers. And one of them had babies, and I can remember distinctly watching those little buggers pop out of the pregnant mother, and they're live. But it was quite traumatic because they got eaten. So we immediately went down the next day to Woolworths, the only pet store really, to get a breeding tank, a breeding container to put babies in. So 30 days later, we had another batch, and before long, we had to have a 5-gallon aquarium below that, and we were breeding the platies. It was a lot of fun, and all kinds of things were learned. And anyway, during this, my great uncle Harry, who had a homemade aquarium that he made himself decades before, he got out of World War I, and him and his wife Martha were settling down, and he built the aquarium he's always wanted. Big, thick glass, huge metal frame, big thing. And it was his tank. And anyway, he was getting old, and he saw we were into aquariums, and so we got it. Dad, who's a pretty good carpenter, built a really nice stand for it downstairs in the basement. And so now we had a big tank. Dad also had kind of mastered repairing air pumps, aquarium air pumps. They were highly problematic back then. They didn't last long, and most people would just buy a new one. Well, Dad got spare parts, figured out how to clean it, how to replace the stuff, and so instead of buying a new Silent Giant filter, or air pump, I mean, Dad would fix people's pumps. We were a member of the Southern Minnesota Aquarium Society, and people had just heard that, Dad was pretty good. So anyway, he had this little business fixing pumps downstairs next to the big aquarium, and in town there was only Woolworths, and then there was a fella who lived outside of town by the cemetery. And he had an aquarium shop in the basement of his house. And his house was pretty run down house, older house, real old. And when you walked in, it wasn't very clean, to put it bluntly, and kind of had an odor. He'd been living there for many, many, many years, and going downstairs in the basement was quite hazardous. You had to duck and then watch your feet. And being an old house, the basement didn't even have really brick walls. It was more like rocks. It was just a mess. But down there, he had a bunch of aquariums, all different sizes, all kind of rambled, sitting akimbo, and he had to kind of maneuver around all these weird sized tanks. But he had the best fish there was. He was really good at taking care of the fish, so he had a shop selling fish. Well, it didn't take too long for Dad to figure out that if there was a really nice shop in town, that we could have a pretty good little business. So, Mom and Dad opened an aquarium shop. Dad built a very, very nice finished room downstairs, built some beautiful shelves. We had a long wall of aquariums. The top shelf was 5-gallon tanks. The bottom shelf was a series of 10-gallon tanks. It was really nice looking. There was a lot of fish. We had a couple big show tanks to show off, and then, of course, every supply you needed. So it was a good shop. I'm pretty proud of it. It was popular, successful, and it was just great. I spent my entire teenage years working in the shop, and since it was in the basement of our house, people were constantly walking in. And of course, when they would show up at dinner time, it was always, Ovi, take care of the fish. And I didn't mind that. I really, really enjoyed doing this. You meet people and everything else. So it was really a lot of fun. And in that time, the teenage years of the 60s, the shop would close at 9 o'clock at night, and Dad frequently would go out. And we had after-hour parties in the aquarium shop, and it was just really a lot of fun. You know, the other kids, many of whom were not familiar with fish. But one of the things that we really enjoyed doing was we would shut the lights off, all the lights off, in the tanks, in the room, and so your eyes would get used to the dark, and the only light that was there was the lights of the heater. And the heaters would flick on and off. They're thermostatically controlled, so you'd get, in fact, there's a red light back there. There's a heater right there. And so when that heater, now back then we didn't have lights like you're seeing right now. Okay, that did not exist. This is a LED light. But anyway, so those heaters, when they would flip on, you'd see the fish in the immediate area there. And what was really cool is the heater light would reflect to the next aquariums, and their lights may or may not be coming off. And it was just really wild. So we'd sit there in the total darkness and just watch all these little lights turning on and off and seeing the fish late at night. It was really quite the show. And of course, this was 60s, teenage kids, so it was quite the psychedelic display. And it was a lot of fun. Nice shop. So that shop lasted about 10 years, maybe a little bit longer. So here is my second tank, my 5-gallon tank. So what happened with me is I left home after graduating in 1971, and I had my own aquarium, and I've had aquariums my entire life. 5 or 6 different states, 7 or 8 different homes, and I've always had a tank. And it's funny because in those tanks, and the tanks that I had, it was always, well, someday I'm going to do this. Someday I'm going to do that. And through a set of circumstances, about 10 years ago, I got rid of everything, all my tanks. Now I had decades of junk, every different size air pumps, every valve, all this junk you accumulate when you have aquariums for your life. I just got rid of it all, everything, tanks, everything. And I went a few years without any tanks, and now I started up with this tank. This tank is a really nice little self-contained tank, filter built in, and it's really nice. Now, when we had the aquarium shop, when we would, oh, by the way, there's a gold moon, platy right there. That's what started it all. That exact same fish is what started it 60 years ago. So back then when we sold plants, first of all, they were all floating plants. And they were sold basically to be food for vegetarian type fish. Or they were sold to briefly decorate the aquarium. Crooked here. So now I've learned how to do plants. And now my goal of someday doing plants has now been done. Now in here, and it's kind of hard to see, they're very shy, very timid. I have a bunch of pygmy Corydoras catfish. Okay, now the catfish that were in the other tank were albino Corydoras. So these guys are hidden underneath here. So moving over here, speaking of Corydoras, now we go over to the 20-gallon aquarium. We'll start off here. Here's my Corydoras. I got probably 22 different types, skunk and emerald. And in this area, it's really kind of a happy place for the fish. It's dark. I have fresh water. There's a bubbler in back, but there's not a lot of current. So it's very comfortable for the fish that you're seeing here. And then on the other side of the tank, it's open, not so many plants, and I got the filter in back there. So the filter is blowing out fresh water into there. So there's a lot of current in this part of the aquarium. So these fish here, zebras, rubby-nosed tetras, and to an extent cherry barbs, just love this open area. So these fish are in open area heaven. And these guys over here are the fish that are more calm, closed-in areas. So the purpose of this tank was to see how I could have basically two different environments in the same aquarium. So in this case, we have a slower moving plants and stuff on the left and a more open area. And because there's current, there's no plants floating on the surface, so it's very light. So what I'm doing is I've ordered a new aquarium that's coming in soon. It's a 65 gallon. It's going to be 36 inches wide and 18 inches deep. Now this aquarium here is 20 inches wide, so my new tank is going to be about this deep. Now what I have in that new tank is I'm going to have 2 layers of substrate. I'm going to have a 2-inch to 3-inch layer on the front left third of the aquarium, and then I'm going to have these pieces of excuse me, petrified wood. And the petrified wood is going to build a wall. I'll be putting another piece here that I have to get, but this is going to be the level of the second part of the aquarium. So obviously it's going to be deeper. I'll be able to put deep-rooted plants in that part of the aquarium. Now, of course, with everything, here's my little aquarium stuff. And what we have here is, of course, you got to have the the test kit and everything else. But I have a bottle of water here. It's rather dark, as you can see. This is water. This is tannin. And the reason I have tannin is because I've been soaking a piece of driftwood for several weeks now to get the tannin out. Now the driftwood is really something else. So let's go over here. So here's my stuff. This is the driftwood. Now this piece of driftwood was found by my mother and her sister, so it was Aunt Millie and Uncle Frey with my mom Opal and Dad. They found this up in northern Minnesota before I was born. And I'm not sure, I assume it was slimy and messy. But anyway, Aunt Millie and Uncle Frey took this home and hung it on their wall in a room of the house. So one night, one weekend, I'm not really sure the full story. All I know is that Mom ended up stealing it from Aunt Millie and snuck it home and put it up on our wall in the house. And I don't know the whole story. There was a little bit of animosity, but it ended up being a lot of joking. So this has been in my family since before I was born. This is the size of the aquarium that I'm getting. So what I'm going to do is this area here in the new aquarium will be 2 to 3 inches deep. Then I'm going to have the wall of petrified wood along here. And then this is going to be a total of 6 to 7 inches deep soil. This is then going to go on top of the soil. Now this marker here is how tall the aquarium is. So what that means is, here's the water line. All this is going to be above the water. So what I'm going to do is have plants that have long roots that can live in the water, as well as maybe moss and stuff. So that's where I'm going with my new aquarium. So anyway, this is my little world. It's a very wonderful situation I have. Just very beautiful, very comfortable, very soothing, and just incredible amount of fun. Just an incredible amount of fun.